It is our responsibility to preserve our distinct culture and national identity. We must not lose this uniqueness so that we are always able to say, we are Bhutanese. His Majesty the King. Kuzuzon Bola. Welcome to the 41st session of Bhutan Dialogues. Our theme today is keeping our culture intact in the 21st century. In our modern world, preservation of culture is one of the great challenges. Cultural heritage is the essential record of human existence. A country's culture is the backbone of every nation. If a country loses its culture, it loses its history, as cultures are not developed over a decade or over a century, but require many hundreds, if not thousands of years of practice to be considered as the tradition and culture of a particular place or country. Bhutan is rich in cultural heritage. It treasures and protects the culture. Culture is a way of life. It is the glue that binds people together as people, and we must value our heritage so that we can pass it on to our children with a little bit of ourselves attached to it. What we do now, how we live our lives, and the character we build will add to the heritage we leave behind for the next generation. Preserving and celebrating our culture is a priority for every country and the world. This is a major way of passing on a worthy inheritance to our children and their children's children. I truly hope that no one will ever suggest that McDonald's and Starbucks are ever to be considered an inheritance. This is why it is important to protect and preserve our culture, to ensure that the next generation can also embrace it, just as we did as we inherited the world from our parents. Our guest speaker is Ashi Choden. Ashi is the Executive Director and an art restorer at the Thankha Conservation Centre under the Central Monastic Body. She is also a writer and has authored and edited many books. Ashi also volunteers with spiritual and social organisations and is one of the young pioneers who works towards promoting and preserving Bhutan's cultural heritage. Our host is Dr. Karma Phuntsho, who is president of the Loden Foundation and also the founder of Shejun, Agency for Bhutan's Cultural Documentation and Research, a project that aims to carry out an extensive audio-visual documentation to support local communities to preserve and pass on Bhutan's rich cultural heritage to future generations. 3 closing comments. Please subscribe to Bhutan Dialogues on YouTube. Follow Bhutan Dialogues on Facebook and tune into our podcast Bhutan Dialogues on Castbox. Secondly, grateful if everyone can keep their questions short and to the point for the Q&A. For our online viewers, please drop your questions in the chat box. Sering and Ugan will be compiling the questions and will read them out, and the speaker will answer your questions approximately halfway through the session. Please allow me to close with a quotation from the UN Secretary General. In the end, it comes down to values. We want the world our children to inherit to be defined by the values enshrined in the UN Charter. Tashi Delay, and thank you.
Kuzasampo, Ashi, and welcome to Bhutan Dialogues, our 41st session. As Jerry explained earlier, I think both of us know that Bhutan is going through massive, rapid cultural transition.
Yes.
I think our worldviews, our belief systems, ideals, values, principles, practices are changing very, very fast. But we don't get to talk much about it. There are very few people who would have the luxury to really discuss these things. Here at Bhutan Dialogues, our hope is to create a forum where we can go in depth into some of these issues, to refine our thoughts. Really, in the case of culture, to see what we can do to, one, sort of articulate the culture effectively to our younger generation and sustain it, if necessary, adapt it, make it relevant to our own times. So it's a great honor for us to have you as a culture expert. And your work, of course, your work has been covered in many places besides the books. Buddhist Door has covered your work. Hong Kong has also covered your work. I think the Economic Journal in Hong Kong, to be precise. Then Asia Society has covered your work. I have been also following your work for many years now. So there's so much I think we can talk about the challenges we face in conserving, in promoting, in sustaining Bhutanese culture. But before we get into that, Ajay, I first want to know where you come from in terms of your background. What are the kind of milestones in your life that brought you where you are to be who you are, so that our audience will also know a bit more about you. So if you can share in brief your life history.
Not much lah. I mean, I was homeschooled for quite some time. And, went to Loden Zampa like everybody else lah. Then went overseas, so not much developments there lah. Got a degree, came back. I think the real impact started when I volunteered for a Buddhist program lah, with His Eminence Kamtur Rinpoche in Nepal. So that's really where the changes started, sort of, I don't know, whatever, how to say, impact happened in my life lah. So from there onwards, then of course I had my children. They also made a large impact to my life lah. And working in this office also lah, it has really changed my perspective of what it means to be a Bhutanese, how we can contribute lah, no matter what your position in life is or what kind of person you are lah.
When you say homeschool, a lot of people in the audience may not necessarily get that. What do you mean by that? I know you also had very early exposure and association with His Holiness Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. What kind of impact such associations had in your life?
Amala believed that it was more important to develop one's values lah, and especially to understand sort of the Buddhist values of like sort of ethic principles, morals, as well as compassion and kindness lah. And she felt it was more important at the time than a school education because I was still young lah. So when I say homeschool, I mean there was two teachers lah, a Thankha teacher and the English teacher, and they would go around with me when we went to all these various tukchins and prayer ceremonies.
Okay. So it's actually a traveling school for yourself.
Yes lah. Rinpoche Chashuve, we went with Rinpoche lah. So that was sort of how we grew up lah at the time.
Can you tell us a little more about your experience in Nepal that you mentioned? How did that sort of open up your interest in Buddhist culture?
Rinpoche pretty much insisted I could coordinate the program lah.
This is Kamtur Rinpoche?
Yes, Kamtur Rinpoche lah. And I was not confident lah because, to be quite frank, I was the person who stayed at home, took care of the kids. So I was like, I don't think I could do it. Then Rinpoche said, no, you can do it. Go ahead. And we coordinated. I mean, we had a wonderful team lah of like almost 20 Bhutanese. And we worked very well together, and we coordinated a program for like over 10,000 people and for about 10 days. And it went really well. And we did everything from cleaning bathrooms to taking care of VIPs and all that kind of thing. And I think that really sort of pushed the boundaries of what one is capable of. So even I think my colleagues at that time also felt, well, we can actually do this more. It's not too bad more. We can, it was successful. So we were quite happy that we could do something like that and contribute something like that.
I think this is a fantastic message for a lot of the young people out there, because we have this inhibition and fear to not do things because we are worried that we may not be able to really do it well. And then also for people who can give these forums and platforms for young people to try out. A lot of people have the fear that they won't necessarily do the work well. So your example is perfect for both the young people who should break through that fear and also older people who should also provide more platforms. Then you got into wall painting conservation. Can you tell us about that?
That was
How did you get into that?
that was a bit of a mistake actually.
I doubt that. I don't think it was a mistake. Because deep down in your heart, I know how much you love wall paintings and the conservation you do. So how did you get into that?
Actually, it was the conservation actually started well before
Yes.
I was already, I think I was in high school when it started. 2003, it started. And it started with, I think everyone is familiar with the Dragon's Gift exhibition that went overseas with all our antiquities.
Yes.
And so there was a group of conservators. And one of them was called Eddie. I think some of them know who Eddie is with this huge hammer.
Yes.
So he started this conservation studio in the monastic body, Tasanalo, and with the monks. But I think they were having some difficulty with management and administration, and so he actually asked my steward grandmother, he was actually quite upset. He said, the office is going to close down, we need somebody there. And then her master just looked over and said, you're not doing anything, no? You can go down and help. And I was like, So it took me a while because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to go down there and not have the capacity or the capability to help. So it actually took me about 3 months to agree, because I was not confident that I would be able to help or make a difference as they wanted, because I don't have the skills or knowledge, to be quite frank. So it was more of an accident. Then my hip that they were like, it's you. We thought an older person is going to come. Then I think at first everyone was a bit skeptical. They were a bit like, you won't last here for more than 2 weeks. Monks are so difficult to work with. By after 2 weeks you'll say, I'm giving up, I'm going back home.
Yes.
But it's been almost seven years now and I haven't left yet, so I think it's going all right.
So what exactly happens in this center which you are leading now? Bhutan Art Conservation, Cultural Conservation Center. Have I got it right? Like BACCC.
It's Buddhist.
Buddhist, sorry.
Yes,
Excuse me, Buddhist. Yes. So can you tell us a little about Buddhist Art Cultural Conservation Center?
Sorry, it's a mouthful.
No, not at all. You can call it BAC. So please tell us a little about what you do there. What kind of center this is, what programs or plans you have.
Our new office is not ready. Yes. I think once the new office is there, it'll live up to its very fancy name.
Yes.
We work in a very small studio next to the Zong with a few monks, about 6 or 7 monks. And we do a lot of conservation work, so we do work for Zhung Dratshang, but we also work in collaboration sometimes with the Department of Culture under the Ministry of Home. So Thankhas, we restore lagangs, and we also do the digitization of antiquities as well as the thumb, that kind of thing.
So mostly focus on the heritage associated with Zhung Dratshang, the central monastic body.
Yes. I think a lot of the work involves in trying to sort of preserve and conserve as well as the continuity of it. So that's the kind of work we do there.
It must be thrilling actually to work with this very old, precious heritage we have. Tell us what you feel when you, for instance, touch a very fragile, old, extremely sort of venerated Thankha or wall painting. I mean, most of us, we don't get the sort of right or the access to even go close to it. So
I don't lie. I send the monks first. I was like, can I touch this? Is it okay? Because I get scared first. Something may happen. But I think it's quite exciting because for me, my background is more to do with research. So usually if they're doing the conservation work, then I have to research whatever antiquity piece is there, send it back as a report together with the item. So it's exciting for me, but I'm not sure if it's exciting for everybody.
Are your fellow monks enjoying it? I'm pretty sure. Yes.
I think it takes time. First, they get a little bit bored, but as they get into it, they get very passionate about it. Our team is extremely passionate about what they do, so I'm quite proud of that.
amazing. Among Bhutanese, a lot of us, when you talk about the regular Bhutanese, devout Bhutanese, instead of preserving and conserving, they are often there to gain something out of it. No, they may get a robe that's Guru Rinpoche's or somebody's, and they'll try to take a little thread out of it. Whereas you are here to do the opposite, to really keep it intact.
Yes, I notice a lot of, when we go to a lot of monasteries or things like that that are in a dilapidated condition, we do tend to notice that a lot of the local villagers or even pilgrims, they do tend to take small pieces as sort of to put in the amulet or even sometimes to eat. To be quite frank, I haven't seen the monk do that. I think because they are custodians and with it every day, so that what we call in Thankha, that namto is not there, no. So they feel quite comfortable, so they don't actually do that, to be quite honest.
So lay people are more sort of driven by beliefs and also using these sacred relics for their own well-being, for their prosperity and so forth. Maybe monks are more enlightened in that respect. They understand the actual. I'm
not going to comment on that. It's up to the individual, but just I noticed that on.
But I think I'm sort of trying to take you to a very important but sensitive issue, I think, because a lot of our fellow Buddhists, they don't really help preserve the relics, right? A lot of them are out there to gain something out of the relic for their own purpose, and that destroys the cultural heritage. And so that challenge you have already seen in many places. Maybe we should change that mindset a little bit, no?
That is up to the individual. I mean, if you want to value the sacred relic or the item as something of a heritage that you want to pass on the story and the sanctity of that place to the next generation, by all means do so. If you want to use that in the materialistic sense to sell something because of your own gains, that is up to the individual. It's not something we can persuade someone not to do.
As a cultural conservator, I'm sure you will sort of, if given the opportunity, you will advise people not to.
Of course, we would advise, but I mean, do we give them get advice from others, do what you want. So, oh, yes.
No, but I think a lot of young people, sometimes they just don't know, and they follow what their parents do or their elders do. And they may also believe that taking a little bit of Shaptrung's clothes or Guru Rinpoche's shoes is actually all right. Whereas in the long run, I think this is going to basically deprive Bhutan of the Tensum heritage we have.
To be quite frank, I haven't seen any younger generation do that till date. But I'm not sure if they do that.
That's reassuring.
I don't know if Doctor gets questions. Usually the younger generation asks me, why is this sacred? Why do we offer butter lamps? Why do we have to do prostrations to the statue? That kind of thing. So I think there's a sense of curiosity with the younger generation, which I think is a positive thing, rather than just blind faith.
And then when you carry out these works of conservation, I've been involved in doing documentation, which is actually much easier than conservation, because we go there, photograph the statue, or in my case, mostly the books. Sometimes you don't even have to touch them, basically. The monks may touch it and lay it out, and you just click the camera and you get the photographs. But you have to work with these objects. And there must be lots of issues and challenges you face on a sort of bureaucratic level, the official sort of permissions, and then to work with the owners of the relics and the cultural artifacts. What kind of issues, challenges do you find?
The actual technical challenges are not as great as the challenges with people and with bureaucracy. Technical challenges, I think there are flexibilities and there are various options you can overcome. As for ownership, I think actually most of the owners are quite open-minded when we explain to them these are the things that are required for conservation, and they're quite willing to sort of have a discussion about it and say what they're comfortable with, what they're not. The biggest obstacle we face so far, especially in the art conservation context, is the bureaucracy. I think there's a lot of do's and don'ts. Maybe some of the don'ts are not relevant anymore in this time and age, but at the same time we're dealing with a lot of sensitive objects that are, you're not allowed to share on social media. At the same time, we need to get this information out there to the young people. So, what can we do? What can't we do? There's a lot of issues with that. Then, even when we do actual conservation, getting all the paperwork is not only a tough thing for us, but even the Department of Culture also, they have a tough time trying to do all that. So, that is a very, very big issue, and I think His Majesty calling on civil service reform is a timely and well-needed thing.
Yes. So I think I've also encountered similar challenges and policies that are counterproductive in a way.
Yes.
For instance, I remember being restricted from photographing some manuscripts. Now, to my knowledge, there are no proper photographs of that manuscript. That if that manuscript got stolen the next day, there was no proof for the owner to say, this is my manuscript, and inform the Interpol, or even if a manuscript is found at the border, found by the police, how would you actually claim it to be yours, because you have no proof. And having an image actually helps prove that, but also if you have a rare book, you keep the original book and share the dharma, put the teachings with others in these copies. So this is what we used to say. But there are don'ts where you are not allowed to photograph, as you said. But what can we do to change this? Are these issues with policies that the government, the cabinet can change, or are these more bigger sort of legislative challenges that the parliament has to change? What would be the solution?
Well, in terms of, I'm not commenting on any other department, but in terms of the Zhung Dratshang, everything is recorded in the thumb which they own. For each labang, there's sort of like a list of antiquities. It's a very long, wordy, lengthy thing, but there's no photographs there. So part of our, actually, the monks requested, they said it's so difficult when the item gets lost. They go to the police. The thumb, there's a wordy, detailed thing, but it's, you can't say it's really this item. So they really wanted it to be digitalized in a way that the Tensung department under the Zhung Dratshang could use this sort of format. So we're doing that for them right now. We're facilitating that. I think in terms of on a higher level, actually we were trying to push for a cultural committee, but it's become a little bit of a chicken egg kind of thing, which one came first. Because in order to have a cultural committee, we need to have all the stakeholders, so not just Zhung Dratshang, not just Department of Culture, but even like Tourism Council. Like for example in Japan, they even have town planning in this cultural committee, so that if there's sacred areas, they would know that around that development would be different. So we were trying to have this cultural committee, but in order to do that, you need a cultural act first. And apparently the cultural act is being revised. But I'm saying, how can you have a cultural act without the committee to comment on it first? So it's still a chicken egg thing right now, but we're still trying to push through for a committee to have sort of like a round table where we can discuss real issues in terms of town planning. I think there's a lot of issues with that. How sort of cultural centers, heritage sites, how are they going to be preserved? How is it going to continue? How is it going to benefit the community? All that kind of thing.
It's so appropriate because recently there was news about some 100 monuments that fall under Thimphu Chomde.
Yes.
But Thimphu Chomde not really having the mandate or clear responsibility to look after them, and the Gyok actually saying it's within Chomde's territory, so we don't really also have that responsibility. And then similarly, I have been also marginally involved in this because I have connections to that place, my sort of ancestral connections, not political connections, where there's some years ago there was a large golf course plan on that sacred spot.
Yes.
That has been shelved. But recently there's a solar plant project on that same sacred spot. So if there was a cultural committee, as you said, that cultural committee could actually tell this is a sacred spiritual landscape, no development projects should happen here. but we don't have that. So
The Department of Culture, actually it comes under their jurisdiction to do so at the moment. La. But I think the issue comes with then they have to get Thankha involved, Gewok involved, the communities involved. So trying to get their cooperation, especially considering Thankha communities look at development as in economical development, la,
yes,
not really cultural development. And cultural development right now is sort of stagnating to the point where they're thinking about it in terms of museums. La. I mean, there's nothing wrong with museums and museum culture. I mean, I love going to museums, la. But we're talking about a living heritage here, so we really don't want to make it into something that's, oh, this is what we did before. We're still doing it, so we want to have that sense of continuity. La. So, I mean, Department of Culture is struggling, the Ministry of Home is still struggling, but if we had that sort of cultural format where everyone is in it together to work together for the betterment of society in terms of cultural development and the continuity of it, I think it would really give a larger sort of perspective on the matter in the long term, the solutions.
Fantastic. I think community involvement is so crucial, and it is as a good news on this solar plant project. It's the community, 34 households out of 39, saying that we don't want a solar plant in this area. But then, as you said, if we don't have a framework in place, it will be very difficult for even the communities to voice their concerns. Another thing you pointed out rightly, this museum fever. Now, when you talk about culture, it's always about sort of having a static preservation, a kind of an archive, instead of helping culture be vibrant and living. And
museums are necessary. I don't mean to think. Of course, they're necessary in a different format. But I'm saying, especially for here in Bhutan, we're having a living heritage. I mean, we do what we do every day. Gokira is not a costume. It's not like other countries where you wear your costume only for special occasions. We wear this every day. And whatever we do in terms of not only ceremonies and rituals, but the way we think, the lifestyle we have is all like a living heritage. So I'm saying, yes, it's okay to have museums. There are certain things that it's nice for people to go visit and say, oh, this is how it's done. But at the same time, we mustn't also ignore that we have a living heritage and that continuity should be sort of passed on and continued. That's our main concern.
Yes. When you do this kind of work, you're quite unique in a way that you're working with the monks on this. And we have a society, although the society is also becoming more and more open and liberal, progressive. Traditional society, a woman working in the environment of the monastics, how do you find that experience? Do you find it very rewarding, enlightening? Do you have challenges working with the monastics?
It's been interesting, mostly positive. I mean, I think when I initially joined, I was a bit worried because I was like, why, I'm the only woman here. But actually, they were very welcoming, and they actually even helped me with my fashion sense. I had very terrible fashion sense.
So
like, you're not color coordinated.
You think the monks have a very good sense of taste and aesthetics?
Actually, they do.
When you look at the butter sculpture, I think they are far better.
They were very good artistic ideas. But on the whole, I think I learned a lot more about my culture and about how, sometimes I think people also have this. I mean, I don't think they intentionally intend to do it, but sometimes there's this tendency to feel like Thimphu is Bhutan. When people refer to issues or problems, it's only Thimphu. I'm like, there's life outside Thimphu too, So the monks are really sort of who brought me to that perspective, like, why there's more to what you're living up there in this isolated place under a rock. Please come out and have a look. So I think they really helped me to look at the wider perspective of what Bhutan is really like, and that really helped transform my view a lot. But they are quite like, how to say, I know I was a bit worried. I was like, oh, people are saying monks are very close-minded. They're so backwards, they don't know anything. But actually, I found them to be the most innovative, creative, flexible. They're in fact quite more flexible than us lay people also. and actually quite open-minded lah. And it really helped to change my perspective of the monastic community lah.
I think that's fantastic news for a lot of people who don't understand monastic education, because there is this view that monks or traditional people are very dogmatic, very superstitious. And so
I mean, people respect monks, but at the same time, they tend to look down on monks also lah. Sometimes they get very hurt lah. We've had interactions where people are like, oh, why aren't they sitting there doing their choko? Why are you bullying them into doing this thing? or sometimes they say, oh, how will they know how to digitalize stuff? They don't know, they haven't been educated in the West. And I'm like, oh, you're looking up at them, but at the same time you're looking down on them. This is very confusing. They're, just because they're wearing robes doesn't mean they cannot also adapt and be life learners. So I've noticed that also.
in fact, talking about this condescending attitude towards the monks, I have myself been a victim. And I think I've shared my story with you earlier, how in the 90s particularly, because of the popularity of modern graduates from universities, traditional scholars and monks used to be so badly treated, looked down so badly. And as a monk, I had experience of people talking about me in English in my own presence. So it was quite hurtful, and I think that partly inspired me to go and get a Western degree.
And become a layperson now.
And become a layperson, yes. So, talking about changes, what do you think should change then in the monastic institutions where you work, so that people don't have this misperception, this wrong perception of monks, and monks also have the opportunity to engage more with the world?
They're changing that lah. I'm not going to suggest changes lah.
Yes.
The monastic body themselves are changing quite a lot lah. They've seen that the 21st century is here. I mean, not that there was anything wrong with what the monastic community was doing lah, but they realized that they need to communicate a little more differently lah, especially with social media and all that kind of sort of different platform lah. So actually the monks are being quite proactive lah. Some of the changes I've seen within the monastic community is different lah. They're actually changing the education system of the Lopen. They're going to incorporate some of the English curriculum, IT curriculum, so that the monks can also be on board in the Lopen. They're also changing the way they're going to teach, because a lot of the monks that come in now are actually from broken homes, broken families, underprivileged. And not like before lah. Before, actually, if you remember, maybe two generations ago, only the best of the best used to come, because that was the only form of education lah. But now with Western education, only people who cannot take care of their children are left out. So they're saying, oh, they really need to open up. So education system is being changed lah. Not the essence, of course, but just the way it's being taught. I think also they have introduced palliative care. So the monks are more involved in the medical sort of system and help the doctors, especially with the elderly, terminally ill patients. And in terms of our conservation, then I think they've been quite proactive. They've told us to please come, let's go on a 20 Dzongkhap tour so everybody can understand what conservation is. How can we do preservation? How can we continue? What do we talk to the younger generation? What do they like? So they're actually having programs where they're learning about Instagram, what's okay on social media, what's not okay, public relations, they're looking at all that. So I think the monastic body is going towards that, and I wouldn't make any more suggestions.
No, that's wonderful. But I'm pretty sure you are also helping these changes happen in the monastic institutions. I think it has to be a collective effort. Especially talking about, and I think we have had some conversation on this also, palliative care, which is very, very interesting and also very important. As we know, I think the next big challenge Bhutan will face would be mental health.
Yes.
I think our young people are now going through lots of addiction, especially screen addiction. Social media making us totally restless, not only young people, in fact, I'm myself having difficult time trying to keep my computer and phone away from me. So in such a scenario, our sort of religious figures had to take on more pastoral role. No? There has been so much of this priestly ritual role that monks and lay priests play, but there has to be a shift to go from there to take up counseling, therapeutic pastoral care. So beyond palliative care, is there any?
To be quite frank with you, actually, maybe about a generation ago, monks were actually very much part of society in that they were your uncle, your brother, somebody you knew. So there was always some monastic, because I remember, not just because of how I grew up, but there's always a monk there in the background giving us advice, spiritual advice, helping families and communities negotiate, mediate. I think that's changed a lot in the past 20 years, and monks have become more, not because they want to be, but they become more like a ritualistic role, because people are perceiving them that, because that's the Western perception of how monks are. It's not really our Bhutanese perception, but because the younger generation may or may not understand, but then they perceive them to be more of a ritualistic, chokotani, somewhere quite far. And I think because they understand that, that is also something that the monastic body is looking at in terms of mental health. So not that they are saying they will replace, of course, the medical team, but in terms of assisting them in terms of emotional, spiritual, on that kind of side. So I think they are doing some programs like that, and they are also suggesting to get training and things like that. But probably when the COVID situation improves.
And from how I see it, Ashi, how our religious figures, both the monks and some lay priests, not with the priestly elders in the villages, sort of lost that role of being advisors and counselors and role models, is down to the communication gap you have created. Modern education brought in a new set of sort of worldviews and medium of communication, and somehow the two generations of Bhutanese got separated. So maybe what we have to do now effectively is address these communication gaps, so monks can relate to the younger people can also relate to the monastic elders. With regard to that, what kind of sort of engagement, you mentioned social media, what are the ways? I mean, you yourself, I think as a mother, you try to transmit the values that you believe in to your children.
I try.
So maybe that's what more Bhutanese need to learn. Elder Bhutanese learn how to communicate with the younger ones, and younger ones also pick up the language or do whatever they need to sort of listen to the elders to fix the communication gap.
That's on so many multi-levels. It's just, there's no one solution to that. It's a collective effort. And I really feel that if society on all different levels can work together to improve sort of this cultural aspect, I think only that way the solution will come about. Of course, there's so many institutions, so many individuals trying that, including yourself, Doctor. So from the monastic side, yes, we're hoping that our office that will be ready soon will sort of operate as an informal center for the monastic body. Because to be quite frank, a lot of youth feel quite hesitant to go to the Zong. They're like, oh my God, do I have to come here? What do I do? Do I chaseshe? Do I turn here? What do I do? They get quite apprehensive, and all that is disturbing their mind so much that by the time they see the lam or whoever, they're like, all these thoughts are going like this. So we thought that if there's a sort of a informal place where the monks and younger generation or even older generation, whoever is interested, will come together and actually do sort of proactive things. Because if you notice, Doctor, when you're actually working on something, it's easier to talk rather than sitting like this. So if you're actually working on something and working together, I think understanding each other in that way is much easier than trying to just sit there and listen only. So we're looking for a more interactive platform.
Yes, that's wonderful. I think our young people do need that kind of very inviting, informal, almost casual sort of space where they can come and express themselves, feel comfortable. But I want to go back to art, Ashi. I think art is such a wonderful way to heal the mind. And when we go around the country, I do that almost every week, to go to a new temple or so and look at art. You do that much more than I do. How can young people learn to not only appreciate their cultural heritage, but to find this healing, therapeutic experience of sort of looking at a wall painting or a Thankha or a statue? I'm sure you have come across that. You brought your daughter with you along today. What kind of things would you do to engage young people?
I didn't force her, she wanted to come also.
So you have already managed to inspire her to come to this
I don't think it's any inspiration. She wants to see if I make a fool of myself and make fun of me later.
Yes. But we need young people to engage in things like this. No? So I'm sure you have experience. Especially, why don't you share your experience of getting into art? There was one really beautiful experience you shared about Sangkhenchen.
You mean the Menchuna one?
Yes. So Menchuna is this temple in Paro.
Yes, Menchuna is this very small little temple in Paro, quite insignificant looking actually. So when my first trip there, I have to be quite frank, I hadn't joined Tasa at the time, and I just went there, put in the Bhadkeja, 2-3 prostrations, had a look around and went, okay, couldn't see anything through that dirty glass. I was just like, okay, went, didn't make any impact. But of course, my grandmother and Amala were like, this is a very sacred place of Tsang Khenchen Pende Jamso. I was like, who is this Tsang Khenchen Pende Jamso? Okay, and his name is so long, I'm not going to remember Silabbe. Then the next time we went was with the monks, and by that time I joined, had understood la. Then when we went there, we had to actually look at everything. We had to look at the murals and all that. We opened up the dusty murals, got allergy, everything. But it was so amazing. The paintings were as beautiful as the ones in Tango, which are considered actually one of the best sort of artistic depictions in Bhutan. So I was like, oh wow, this small place has this, huh? And it was like, there was all these various cherries there. And some of them had like these swollen faces, and they said, oh, because Tsang Khenchen passed away, this thing. And I was like, oh, quite moved. Then they said, oh, next door, right in the mountain, next thing is there's like ruins of 10,000 disciples. I said, what? He said, yeah, Tsang Khenchen was very famous. He came from Tibet and he helped Shabdung Rinpoche to develop the sort of artistic sort of skills, Zorik Kila. So, for example, craftsmanship, like making statues, painting, all that. So, he actually made what we call the Shumdila. Bhutanese ki artistic, unique to Bhutan only. He created that. Then all the monks actually came there to learn from him. So, he's saying, yeah, he had over 10,000 disciples. I said, oh, his house is as big as this space. He had 10,000 disciples. Yeah, I was quite shocked and I was quite amazed also. And it also sort of changed my view that it doesn't mean, when you really think about history and you read history, you think Shabdung is this very big one-man show, Superman Zundala, does everything himself, and you're like, oh, this is impossible, there's one person like this, but he's there. But he's so far untouchable, not relatable, Mullah. But when you think about, there's people there behind him, helping him work towards unifying Bhutan, towards creating the state, and all these various skills came together, and someone as simple as Tsang Khenchen, who must have carried just a small jola and stayed like a tuktok, had this much impact on us that even after God knows how many hundreds of years later, we're still, appreciating that now. That just sort of transformed my whole view about things.
Yes. He's also the biographer of Shabdung,
yes.
Very well known in Bhutan for his legacies. So, I think it's almost time for questioning the audience, but I want to ask you this. If you were to hope to make monastic education as prestigious as it was a few years ago, or make Tsang Khenchen's artwork as celebrated as K-pop or some other artistic creations around the world, what should we do, especially among the young people, to sort of win their interest, to to make them value the traditional artistic sort of heritage we have. Any tips you have?
I know.
Parental role? Do you think
Yes, la. I think education is very important, la. I think educational, having that sort of how to say, la. Right now, of course, I know we are going to have educational reforms also, la, but I think it's very important that they also include perhaps the monastic community in the development and changes and transformations of the educational system, la. If that's possible, I think changes can happen there and the young generation can understand our culture better. Secondly, I think I know a lot of people target the youth, but I also feel it's very important for parents to also understand, so that because most of our influence or our sounding board is usually at home, to be quite frank. And I've been fortunate enough that my mother has been a good sounding board to tell me, oh, these are the stories. My grandmother's been like that too. So I would really like everyone else to have a similar experience as well. So I think, yes, parents and education do play a very important role in sort of putting that mindset for the younger generation.
So more cultural exposure and education in the upbringing at home, and also education in the schools?
Not really. Like, I mean, I know people feel like, oh my God, it must be so difficult, where do I start? But even if it's as simple as telling stories about your grandparents also, even that is interesting, how they lived before. Even that is part of our culture. So just simple things like that also, I think, is quite a big step. It's the first step.
Yes. So we'll now open the audience.
The first question. Culture is always evolving. How do you balance preservation and evolution of culture without losing the essence or roots of a particular culture or tradition? And the second one, apart from the effects on the economy due to the pandemic, what are your views on whether the pandemic has had an effect on our culture and the efforts in keeping it intact?
In terms of preservation and conservation, I think this is a sort of issue that we always struggle with, in that when you say preservation and conservation, people have that concept that it should not move with the times. It should just stay stuck like that. And culture and people's thought process and everything is changing, but the way it's done is always there. But to me, I think working with the monastic body, I found that actually the monks work quite well in preserving and conserving, in terms of, like, for example, when we do prayers, the meaning behind the prayers as to why it's done is because we want to understand our own nature more, in terms of like compassion, kindness. In terms of that, I think that doesn't change, because even though if we evolve in terms of having new technology, in terms of the way we communicate, we're still the same human there. 100 years ago, the humans struggling with having like suffering, having anger, we still have those issues right now because we haven't really worked with the mind more. So I think in terms of that development, sure, it'll happen. Sure, communication will change. Sure, the way you want to communicate, the way you want to work with that is fine. But I think the essence itself will not change, because it's something that's relevant and it's a timeless concept, no? I mean, we're talking about like the Buddhist concept here. So Anzumbe Buddha is something that's always, to me, is something that's always relevant. I think actually it has been positive, in terms of that people are actually looking more inward, meaning at home rather than going out. So people are actually going around the country, traveling, understanding about their lives. And I'm actually seeing a trend on social media where people are actually going around saying, my hometown is like this, did you know it's like that? And I think it's quite been a positive impact as well, apart from all the other issues.
Yeah, if I may add, Ajit, so my take on where do we draw the fine line between preservation and the changing nature of culture, evolution of culture. I often say we personally need to do enough discussion and study and understanding, have enough understanding, and then we'll be able to perhaps classify them into 3 categories. There's certainly one set of culture, like the wooden plough or the bullock, which will have to be shelved. We can preserve them in museums as historical pieces, but we will have to let go a lot of these cultural traditions. Then there is a second set which will be relevant for Bhutan, especially in terms of its sort of cultural integrity and sovereignty, like Shukjal Philum Sokpa is something that Bhutanese state will have to carry out to show its uniqueness. And they will be relevant only to Bhutan, not necessarily to other countries. But then the vast majority would be in the third set that you mentioned, the timeless wisdom and timeless sort of values that we have, such as loving kindness, compassion, interdependence, community solidarity, voluntarism. These should be translated in different forms everywhere, universally is what I feel. And this is what we really need to promote, and probably one of the best products that we can also sell to the rest of the world through GNH. And COVID, again, I've had some reflection on culture COVID issue, and I think the COVID period has been wonderful for self-reflection, as you said. And we have, firstly, thanks to the leadership, we have managed to avoid the major havoc that COVID has wreaked elsewhere. But it is also the cultural strength that we had, the communities that came together and abided by the laws. I mean, this didn't happen in other countries. No?
Yes,
The Bhutanese are culturally very willing to be amicable, think of the greater good.
Yes.
We had then the monastics and the religious people doing all their prayers and rituals to avert. So I think we have to give a lot of credit to culture for our success. And then the COVID has also benefited culture, as you said. Now, a lot of people start to look at their roots, do local pilgrimage. There has been a lot happening within the country. If COVID didn't happen, most of the holidays would have been in Bangkok or Delhi or somewhere else. So, a lot of benefit. We can, next two questions.
Is it worth keeping parts of our culture or tradition intact if they might be considered sexist in the modern world? And what is Ajit's view on the recent news of communities surrendering their community havans to the Zhung Dratshang due to a lack of knowledgeable caretakers, people migrating out of the village, and lack of interest from the younger generation?
In terms of sexism, I have to say that is something that society does and is not really there in terms of spirituality. Spirituality actually thinks the feminine form is actually has more, is a higher form than the male actually. Sorry, doctor.
It's totally fine.
But it's just, I think that is just a sort of social barrier. That is something actually, to be quite frank, was not as present maybe 3 generations ago. And to be quite frank, it has actually come with the influence of sort of the, not only Western but even our neighboring countries also. That sort of cultural influence has come into here, and our culture has somehow absorbed that and developed into that. So don't really think that sexism is actually an overt thing that is part of our hemagi. So to me actually that is something we should be discussing socially, not really any culture, remember, it's a social culture. Ideally, of course, I would like the community themselves to take care of it, but the reality of the situation is that monasteries are not what they were in the 17th century or 15th century. Back then they were cultural hubs, they were spiritual hubs, they were also political hubs. The lamas that were associated with that actually had political sway over the community. So I think in terms of the relevance, it has changed now to only in terms of spirituality, and a lot of the community now is thinking in a Western way. Or is this monastic sort of community or monastery, is it economically viable? That is the issue that we always have. And so because of that, a lot of them have Western education, they're not keen on taking care of the monastery, and perhaps they don't know the history, or they do, but they don't have the time. So Anizum Bev Virgin, and if it's given to Zhung Dratshang with the good intention of continuing it, then okay. But if ideally, if the community could take care of it, that would be great. This is what I mean by we should have a cultural committee, because this is where we would come into dialogue with the communities themselves, and because this is not just an issue in some certain pockets, it actually will be happening and will happen in the next 20 years. So it's something that I hope will be an open format where we can discuss.
I think I would like to reiterate what Ashi said on the issue of gender. But when you talk about culture, of course, culture is not monolithic. It's not just one culture as such, right? There are so many cultural traditions we have received from so many different places. And if you're really talking about the high Mahayana and Vajrayana culture that we sort of idealize, that we regard very highly of, then there's no sexism as such. But then if you're talking about some sort of low-level belief systems that we inherited from external, outside cultures, such as women having to be born 9 times to become a man, it's a totally un-Buddhist, ridiculous belief system we inherited, and we should probably give that up. So, as I said earlier, there are some sets of beliefs that we really have to get rid of now for our times. But then if you really, truly look at even the Bhutanese social culture, like the very early forms, like the Lops or the Monpas, there they have much less sort of gender sort of bias and imbalance than we have in the more modernized, more sort of sophisticated societies, I think. And one of the sad things that you must have noticed as well, there is much more sort of sexism creeping in insidiously through the new modern sort of cultures that we are adopting, right?
Yes, like I don't know how the other women in the audience feel, but usually when I go to the village, I feel there's less gender bias. It's more about what you're capable of doing, whether you're a girl or a boy. I mean, I know in some pockets there are some where they're gender biased, but most of them are like, if the woman can do the equal work as a man, it's fine. It's more about the work, the practicality of it, not so much about your gender. So I think, of course, physically sometimes I will ask a guy to carry the box for me if it's too heavy. But I mean, mentally, I think the capability and the capacity is actually up to the individual and not really based on gender.
But then, having said that, some religious institutions and practices are sort of fixed. And for instance, do you think we can imagine a female Namneten in the next 20 years?
I know you've asked me this question and I said I will not answer right now.
I'm just wondering.
I mean,
open-ended question, of course.
No, this is a hot topic debate, and if I say anything, I'm sure I'll be criticized. I mean, I think the possibility is there, but it's up to how open-minded people are. I'm not saying that religion has spirituality has restricted the gender, saying, if they have the capability and the capacity and say sort of the enlightened sort of capability to do that, I don't think that it would be an issue. But of course, whether society accepts that or not, and whether she has that kind of obstacles or not, I think she may have to have a lot of challenges, more so than male gender, because of the way society is created.
So, for instance, if Hacham Kille of Tangu is living right now, I would have imagined she would be fully qualified to be more than a Neten. A lot more.
Please explain who is Hacham Kille.
Hacham Kille is the daughter of Tenzin Apke and was very, very well respected as a religious figure in her times. No? We are also nearing the end of our session. It's almost 1 hour. So, Aji, my final question to you is...
So long as it's not controversial, Mela.
No, it's a very personal one.
Yes.
So what do you do to keep yourself mentally and physically fit and sharp, to sort of stay on top of things when you face challenges? What kind of habits do you have? Reading, meditation? A lot of people have shared with us that they do reading or they go on walks. So...
do all of that, it's nothing extraordinary.
Yes.
Just reading. Mostly, if we can, hiking, trekking.
Yes.
But if there's no time for that, then usually spending time with my family.
Yes. So outdoor.
Usually big support.
You like going outdoor?
Very much.
Yes.
I think that's very refreshing, especially when you want to get away from everything.
And apart from hiking and going out, do you do also any internal spiritual practices? Which
yes,
you don't probably want to share.
Yes, a little bit here and there.
But last time you said that if you're facing an issue or a difficulty, you have one specific approach on how you would solve it.
I just face it head on.
Yes. So you.
I wasn't like that before, but I think after some life experiences, I said, hey, it doesn't matter now, what's the worst that could happen? I might as well face it head on. So best I can, I usually face it head on. If I'm terrified of it, I push myself to do it.
So do you first weigh the pros and cons a bit, or you imagine the worst case scenario if it doesn't work out, and then?
I imagine the worst case scenario and I think whether I can bear with it or not.
Yes.
I said, okay, if it's a gossip, okay, it will be 2-3 days and then somebody will say something new and they'll forget, okay, no problem. But if it has long-term consequences, then I really have to think about who it will affect, because for myself it's fine, but then of course I have to think about the people around me also.
Yes.
So weighing all the pros and cons, then I tend to find a solution and face it head on.
So we often ask our guests to share 2 books that have most influenced them, or 2 of their favorite books, and why. But in Ajit's case, I thought I should probably not ask you about books, but about art in temples, which are 2 sort of, or 3 or even more favorite temple wall paintings that you would recommend people to go and look at and draw inspiration from. How should they look at it?
For me, first would be Dungtsilaga in Parola, built by Tonton Gyalpo.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely fascinating because I know it's quite dark, so take a torch. But it's fascinating because when you start,
Yes, it's around now.
So you start with Tonton Gyalpo as a young person, that's how it starts first. And then there's all sort of the lums that are associated with him at the time, including Jeshiru Kese. Then as you pass on and go through, there's like the 16 arats, but they are depicted in an Indian style, which is unusual because for us, we actually do the Tibetan Chinese style. So this one is very unusually depicted. Then as you keep going, Korala, you end up with Tonton Gyalpo as an old man in the last. So it's like as though you've gone through his whole life story, and then you end up there. Then when you go upstairs also, there's all the depictions of the thing. It has a real energy. So that would be one. And the second one, which is on my bucket list after the rainy season is finished, is Risum Gyalpo.
That's in Tashiangse.
Yes, Anidi, the murals, they are absolutely exquisite. It details the life story of Lord Buddha. The artist was a Khampa artist, but the detail of it, I think it will take you about 3 days to actually look at the whole thing. So it's a very small labang, but the beauty of it is quite something. So those 2 would be the ones.
Dungtsilagang, if the audience didn't quite get it, one thing I think Ajit didn't point out yet, she may elaborate on this later, is Dungtsilagang wall paintings are generally dated to the 19th century at the time of Ji Sherab Gelsen. But then you were carrying out through Her Majesty Royal Grandmother's initiative the restoration of the wall paintings. And in process of that work, you discovered behind the shelf, not the big sort of altar, some older paintings of Kunrik.
Yes.
So can you tell a little, because this adds a lot of interesting dimensions to the art world. There you have the 19th century art, and then suddenly this small part of the 14th century, would you say, or 15th?
15th. We actually, our team found it. They were very excited. They called me up and said, I think it's the original one. So we went to have a look, and Imbala, it was behind the Chisham, because actually about 17th century onwards, most painters paint on cloth and then stick it onto the wall. But usually if it's Tibetan origin or 14th, 15th or earlier, usually it's painted directly on the wall. So we found a small sort of piece and it's very interesting because the artwork is very similar to that of the silk root. So like the clothes are like different and they're more not like Gurumuche and like how to say Shabtung and all were not like of course Shabtung 17th century, but Gurumuche and all was not that much worshipped. It was more like Bodhisattvas, Buddhas, Anizumba. So that little piece is there, so that you can go and see in the inner sort of circle.
So now it is left
it's left there open, uncovered, so everyone can see. So that's quite an interesting thing to see the variations of that also. 15th and 17th.
Yes. If you're going to Paro, take Ajit's advice and visit Dumchel Hagam. It's right near the town, so it's not at all difficult to get there. And it's such an enjoyable piece of architecture and also such rich art in it. So with that, I would like to conclude the session. And as usual, as I conclude, I always conclude with the Bhutanese proverb. And today I chose this. Ranglu Rangim Mashin Tsawar Tomboda. One who is not aware of one's culture is like a tree standing on rotten roots. So quite so bound to fall. And I think I was sharing earlier with Jerry how culture is actually the psychological anchor for a person. That it is also the sort of social fabric to bind a society together. And particularly for Bhutan, we boast of how culture is the distinctive mark Bhutan has to sort of defend its sovereignty. So I think it's so critical. And thank you very, very much for coming and sharing your stories about culture.
Yes,
thank you, Ajit.